Imagine a place where the sky disappears, where sunlight is just a distant memory, filtered by endless layers of green foliage that intertwine like ancestral webs. Imagine a territory where every step presented unexpected dangers, not necessarily because of hostile forces, but because of nature itself with its extreme challenges. This is Vietnam during the 19th and 60s, a piece of land in Southeast Asia that would become the scene of one of the most controversial conflicts of the 20th century. But today, we will not just talk about war. We will speak of something much more primitive, much older than any human conflict. We'll talk about the jungle, of the vegetation so dense that it turned men into shadows, strategies into complex challenges, and the very notion of military operations into something completely unrecognizable. When the first American soldiers landed in Vietnam, many came from cities, from Midwestern farms, from orderly suburbs where trees were decorative and gardens were planned. Nothing, absolutely nothing in their conventional military training could prepare them for what they would find in those lands. The Vietnamese jungle was not simply a background scenario. She was an active participant in the conflict, a force that did not choose sides, but that certainly favored those who knew her intimately. For American soldiers, this impenetrable vegetation represented something far beyond a tactical obstacle. She was a living, breathing labyrinth that enveloped everything and everyone in its suffocating moisture and its relentless challenges. Before we continue this journey through the green paths of this story, I would like to make a small request. If you are enjoying this content, please subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you are watching this video. Your participation greatly helps our work to reach more people interested in history and human challenges in the face of natural adversity. Vietnam's vegetation is the product of millions of years of tropical evolution. Located between the equator and the Tropic of Cancer, the country receives torrential rains for half the year and intense heat throughout the annual cycle. When we talk about density, we are not using a figure of speech. We are talking about places where you can be less than 5 meters from someone else and not be able to see them. Places where visibility rarely exceeds 3 or 4 meters in any direction. The top layer of the forest, known as the canopy, can reach heights of 40 to 50 meters, creating a natural roof that blocks up to 90% of sunlight. Beneath this canopy is an underworld of perpetual dimness where creeping plants, thorny shrubs, vines and bamboos compete fiercely for the little light they can penetrate. Vietnamese jungle trees have developed survival strategies over millennia. Its roots form complex networks, often elevated above marshy ground, creating natural traps for unsuspecting feet. The trunks are often covered with slippery moss, making it impossible to use them as support. And then there are thorns. Thousands, millions of thorns. Some plants have developed thorns so sharp and sturdy that they can pierce leather boots and even tougher fabrics. For a soldier carrying 20 or 30 pounds of equipment, moving through this vegetation meant a constant challenge, a struggle not only tactical, but against the very flora that seemed determined to stop him from advancing. But dense vegetation presented not only physical challenges. There were also psychological issues that deeply affected the soldiers. Claustrophobia was a constant companion. Men accustomed to open spaces, to distant horizons, suddenly found themselves confined in green tunnels where the world was reduced to a few cubic meters of space. The sky became an abstraction. The sun, a theoretical concept. Many soldiers reported feeling as if they were being swallowed alive by the jungle, as if the plants were closing behind them, erasing any trace of their passage. This feeling of being consumed by nature created immense psychological stress, adding to the already considerable challenges of the situation. The impossibility of seeing beyond a few meters had devastating tactical implications. The entire American military doctrine of the time was based on fire superiority, coordination of large units, and close air support. But how do you coordinate large units when you can't see the men 10 feet away? How do you apply fire superiority when you cannot identify targets? What do you call air support when even pilots can't see through the vegetation cover? The jungle neutralized many of the technological and organizational advantages of the American Army, forcing soldiers to operate in conditions where numbers and technology were far less important than knowledge of the terrain and adaptability. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers had a huge advantage in this environment. Many of them had grown up in rural villages, some in the jungle itself or nearby. They knew the natural sounds of the forest and could instantly identify any noise that did not belong to that environment. They knew which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which could be used as medicine. They knew the movement patterns of animals and could use this knowledge to camouflage themselves or to identify the presence of other groups. Most importantly, they had developed tactics specifically designed to take full advantage of dense vegetation. Strategic positions were established in places where vegetation formed natural corridors. Observation points were established with carefully calculated fields of view, allowing observers to see first. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the famous supply route that connected North and South Vietnam, is a perfect example of how dense vegetation could be used strategically. This was not a single road, but rather a complex network of trails, some of them so narrow that only one person could pass at a time, all of them hidden under the jungle canopy. Despite intense and constant bombardment by the American Air Force, the Ho Chi Minh Trail remained operational throughout the war. The reason was simple. The vegetation was so dense that the bombs, even when they hit their targets, had limited effect. An open crater in the jungle would be covered by new vegetation in a matter of weeks. The felled trees would simply be removed or bypassed. Nature itself seemed to be working to repair any damage-making attempts to permanently stop the trail virtually useless. For American soldiers on patrol, the typical day in the jungle was an experience of constant physical challenge. The heat was oppressive, often exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, with humidity close to 100%. Under the forest canopy, there was no breeze. The air was heavy, laden with moisture and the smell of vegetable decomposition. Sweating was inevitable and constant, but the sweat did not evaporate into saturated moisture, it just soaked the uniform, making it heavy and causing skin irritations. The clothes never dried completely. Boots remained moist for days, leading to problems such as trench foot, a painful condition where the skin of the feet begins to decompose due to prolonged exposure to moisture. Moving through dense vegetation required extraordinary physical effort. It was not possible to simply walk. Every step needed to be calculated, tested. Branches needed to be moved away, vines needed to be cut or contoured. Bamboo, in particular, was extremely challenging. Bamboo forests created almost impenetrable barriers, with stems so densely clustered that it was necessary to literally make their way through them, meter by meter. The crackling of branches, the rubbing of leaves, the sound of boots in the mud. All this announced the presence of a patrol. American soldiers quickly learned that in the jungle, silence was impossible, and invisibility was an illusion. There was always a feeling of being watched. The jungle wildlife added another layer of danger and discomfort. Vietnam is home to some of the most poisonous creatures in the world. Serpents such as the Russell viper and the Krite snake were common in many areas. These serpents were difficult to see in the twilight of the forest and had the disturbing habit of taking shelter in places that soldiers used to rest, such as fallen logs or depressions on the ground. A bite from one of these snakes, far from proper medical help, posed a serious health risk. But snakes were not the only concern. There were also spiders large enough to cover the palm of one hand, some with painful stings. There were leeches that would attach themselves to the skin whenever soldiers went through water or mud, sucking blood until they became the size of a finger. There were insects of all kinds. Many of them are capable of transmitting tropical diseases such as malaria, dengue, and typhoid. Mosquitoes were a constant and tormenting presence. Its clouds filled the air at dusk and dawn, and even during the day in the dimness of the forest. The incessant hum and constant stings tested the patience and sanity of the soldiers. Even more serious was the risk of malaria. Despite preventive measures, including the regular distribution of anti-malarial drugs, many soldiers contracted the disease. The fever, chills, and debilitation caused by malaria turned sturdy men into temporary invalids, reducing the operational capacity of units and forcing medical evacuations that put helicopters and their crews at risk. Vegetation also created enormous challenges for navigation. Conventional topographic maps had limited utility in the jungle. The terrain features that would normally be used for navigation, such as elevations, valleys, and waterways, were often invisible under the vegetation cover. Hills and depressions were difficult to identify when you could not see beyond a few meters. Compasses worked, but with the constant movement required to traverse the vegetation, maintaining a precise course was extremely difficult. It was very easy for a patrol to walk in circles without realizing it, especially when every tree, every bush, every section of the jungle looked exactly like every other. Radio communication, so essential to modern military operations, was severely hampered by dense vegetation. Radio waves did not penetrate well through thick foliage and moisture. The range of portable radios was drastically reduced, sometimes to just a few hundred meters. This meant that small units on patrol could easily lose contact with their bases or other units. Coordinating actions, requesting support, or even reporting situations became a challenge. Often it was necessary to find a clearing or a high point to establish reliable communication, but doing so meant exposing yourself and wasting precious time. The encounters in the dense jungle presented extreme challenges. The inability to see clearly until it was very close meant that the first indication of contact was often sudden and disorienting. The vegetation offered an advantage to those who knew the terrain. For the soldiers in surprise, the options were limited. Seeking cover meant throwing yourself on the ground or behind the nearest vegetation, but in the dense jungle almost everything looked the same, and it was difficult to identify positions that offered adequate protection. Responding was tricky when you couldn't see clearly. Maneuvering was risky because you could easily part with your unity in confusion. Many of these meetings ended as quickly as they began, with the groups disappearing into the vegetation. Attempting to clear areas of the jungle to create fields of view and safety zones has led to the development of controversial tactics. One of them was the extensive use of herbicides, the most famous of which was Agent Orange. The idea was simple in theory. If you can't see through vegetation, eliminate vegetation. Military planes sprayed millions of gallons of these chemicals over vast areas of the Vietnamese jungle, trying to defoliate trees and shrubs, expose hidden trails and facilities, and create zones where visibility would be restored. The results were mixed at best. Yes, in many places the vegetation died, at least temporarily. But the tropical jungle has an extraordinary capacity for regeneration. New vegetation appeared quickly, sometimes even denser than before. Besides, the effects of herbicides on human health, both from Vietnamese living in the sprayed areas and from American soldiers themselves exposed to the chemicals, would be felt for decades after the end of the war, making it one of the most bitter legacies of the conflict. Another attempt to deal with dense vegetation was the use of large-scale search operations. Large units would be sent to sweep specific areas of the jungle, trying to find bases, supply depots, and identify military activities. Vegetation made it impossible to maintain coherent formations. The units fragmented into small groups that tried to maintain eye and ear contact with each other. And the opposing forces, knowing the terrain, could simply retreat deeper into the jungle, avoiding confrontation when it was not advantageous and choosing to engage only when conditions favored their methods. Helicopter landing zones were crucial for jungle operations, allowing troops to be inserted and withdrawn, wounded to be evacuated, and supplies to be delivered. But creating these zones was another story. In the dense Vietnamese jungle, there were not many places where a helicopter could land safely. Natural fireplaces were rare and often guarded precisely because they were the few places where helicopters could operate. This meant that it was often necessary to create clearings artificially. Explosives were used to knock down trees, creating small areas where helicopters could descend. But this process was noisy, time-consuming, and clearly announced his intentions. In addition, these artificially created clearings were often small, often allowing only 1 or 2 helicopters to land at a time, making operations slow and helicopters vulnerable during the critical landing and takeoff period. The experience of being injured in the dense jungle was particularly difficult. In conventional situations in open ground, injuries could be reached relatively quickly by doctors and evacuated for definitive treatment. In the jungle, everything was more complicated. A soldier wounded 50 meters from his comrades could be effectively isolated if the vegetation was particularly dense. Reaching it could take many precious minutes as other soldiers made their way through the bushes and vines. Then there was the challenge of transporting it to a landing zone where a medical evacuation helicopter could land. Carrying a stretcher through dense vegetation was extremely difficult, requiring multiple soldiers and progress measured in meters per minute. For doctors, working in the jungle presented enormous challenges. They needed to try to stabilize wounded people in primitive conditions, surrounded by vegetation with inadequate lighting and on uneven surfaces covered in mud and debris. The night in the jungle brought its own intensified challenges. The darkness under the forest canopy was already deep during the day. At night, it became absolute. Even on full moon nights, little or no light penetrated through the layers of foliage. Night vision goggles of the time were primitive and ineffective in the near-total darkness of the jungle. This meant that the soldiers were essentially blind, relying only on hearing and touch. Each sound became amplified in the imagination. The falling of a branch could sound like steps approaching. The movement of an animal in vegetation could be mistaken for human movement. The senses themselves, hyperstimulated by fear and adrenaline, could play tricks. Soldiers reported seeing movements that did not exist, hearing voices that were not there. The stress of spending nights in the jungle feigned this total darkness. It caused significant cumulative psychological impact. The advanced bases and observation posts established in the jungle needed to be constantly defended against the vegetation itself. Plants did not respect human fortifications. Vines grew on barbed wire. Roots penetrated bunkers. Within weeks, the jungle was beginning to reclaim any space that had been taken from it. Keeping perimeters clean and fields of vision open required constant, strenuous work. Men who were not on patrol often spent hours cutting through vegetation, a task Sisyphus was never really finished with. Abandoning a post for just a few weeks was enough for the jungle to begin hiding it completely, erasing evidence of human presence with relentless efficiency. The water issue was paradoxical in the jungle. For one thing, water was everywhere. The humidity in the air, the frequent rains, the numerous streams and swampy areas meant that there was rarely a shortage of water in the absolute sense. On the other hand, finding safe water to drink was surprisingly difficult. Stopping or slow-moving water was often contaminated with parasites and bacteria. Even clean-looking streams could harbor pathogens. Soldiers carried water purification tablets, but did not always use them correctly or consistently. Waterborne diseases were common, adding another item to the long list of ways the jungle tried to debilitate those venturing into it. Vegetation also dramatically affected the effectiveness of military equipment. Projectiles, when passing through dense foliage, were often deflected or fragmented, severely reducing their effective range. Grenades had their effects absorbed by vegetation. Supporting equipment was less effective when protected not only by conventional cover but by layers of vegetation. Even artillery and aerial bombardment, so devastating in open ground, had little effect on the jungle. The trees absorbed part of the impacts, and the effects were contained by the vegetation. Another difficulty was simply locating the opposing forces. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces have become masters at hiding in the jungle. Their facilities were built with extraordinary skill, covered with layers of logs, earth and foliage that made them virtually invisible. They built underground hospitals, weapons depots, and even complex commando facilities, all hidden under the jungle. The famous Siu Chi tunnel network is the best-known example, but similar systems existed in many other areas. These underground facilities allowed large numbers of people to literally disappear into the earth, using geography itself to their advantage. The logistics of keeping troops in the jungle was a monumental challenge. Everything had to be brought in from the outside: food, water, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, and all this had to be delivered by helicopter or carried by the soldiers themselves, because the dense vegetation made it impossible to use vehicles in most areas. Soldiers often carried backpacks weighing 30 or 40 pounds through the jungle, in tropical weather under constant strain. The physical wear was immense. Men lost weight quickly, not only because of physical exertion but also because heat and stress decreased appetite. Many developed gastrointestinal problems due to field feeding and exposure to pathogens. The operational capacity of a unit could be severely degraded even without direct engagement simply by the accumulated wear and tear of operating in the jungle environment. The topography itself under the vegetation presented challenges. Much of Vietnam is mountainous, with steep hills and deep valleys. Combining rugged terrain with dense vegetation created extremely difficult moving conditions. Climbing a jungle-covered hill could take hours, each meter being a fight against gravity and vegetation. Getting down was equally risky, with the often slippery ground and visibility so limited that you could not see obstacles in front of you. Falls were common, resulting in sprained ankles, broken bones, and other injuries that pulled soldiers out of action without any engagement. Mangrove areas in Vietnam presented their own unique challenges. These coastal regions were covered by mangrove trees that grew in brackish water, creating labyrinths of aerial roots and deep mud. Moving through a mangrove was even harder than through the dry jungle. The water could range in depth from a few inches to more than a meter, and it was often impossible to know how deep it was until you stepped on it. The mud sucked the boots, making each step an effort. The aerial roots created constant obstacles, and mangroves were havens for mosquitoes, leeches, and other parasites. In addition, mangroves were often used as hiding places and routes of movement by the Viet Cong, who knew the safe paths through these treacherous marshes. The rain in the monsoon season added another dimension to the challenges. When it rained in Vietnam, it was not a gentle drizzle. They were violent deluges that turned the jungle floor into deep mud, made streams overflow, and made it impossible to stay dry. Tents offered little protection when the rain could last for days without stopping. All equipment was soaked. Weapons needed constant maintenance to prevent rust and malfunction. Rolls and maps disintegrated. Food would get wet and spoil faster. And all this time, military operations continued. Soldiers conducted patrols in the pouring rain, established knee-deep mud positions, and operated in conditions where it was difficult to distinguish people through water curtains. The dense vegetation also made identification extremely problematic. The combination of limited visibility, extreme stress, and the difficulty of distinguishing people in an environment where everyone wore similar clothes led to tragic situations. Accidents where troops caused casualties in their own forces were a painful reality in the Vietnamese jungle. The inability to see clearly, combined with reactions under extreme pressure, created situations where serious errors were almost inevitable. Tropical diseases were a constant and often debilitating threat. In addition to malaria, there were other diseases such as dysentery, which caused severe diarrhea and dehydration. Fungal skin infections were extremely common due to constant moisture and the impossibility of keeping the body dry and clean. Small cuts and scratches, inevitable when moving through the thorny vegetation, often became infected in the dirty and humid environment of the jungle. Without proper treatment, these infections could become serious. Typhoid, cholera, and hepatitis were also real risks. Maintaining basic hygiene standards was practically impossible. There were no bathrooms, no showers, no laundry. Men lived in a state of constant filth, which only increased the risk of disease. The psychological isolation from being in the jungle for prolonged periods had profound effects on the mental health of soldiers. Unlike previous conflicts where there were clear front lines and rear areas where soldiers could rest and recover, in Vietnam, especially in the jungle, there was no front or rear. There was never a time when you could really relax, because a situation could arise from any direction at any time. This state of constant vigilance, maintained for weeks or months, was psychologically devastating. Men developed what was then called operational fatigue, but which we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included insomnia, hypervigilance, extreme irritability, and flashbacks, and an inability to function normally. The dense vegetation also greatly complicated search and rescue operations. When a helicopter was shot down or a plane crashed into the jungle, locating the wreckage and possible survivors was extremely difficult. From the air, the vegetation cover made it impossible to see through it to the ground. Rescue teams on the ground faced all the usual challenges of moving through the jungle, compounded by the need to reach a specific location quickly. Many pilots and crew members who survived the initial downing of their aircraft faced extremely difficult situations in the jungle before they could be rescued. Reconnaissance operations in the jungle were particularly challenging. Small teams, sometimes as small as 4 or 5 men, would be deployed deep into opposition-controlled territory to observe movements, locate bases, and report on activities. These teams relied entirely on stealth to accomplish their mission. Being so few in number, they could not face larger units directly. The dense vegetation offered hiding places but also made silent movement nearly impossible. These teams operated under extraordinary strain, knowing that any mistake could compromise the entire operation. Some of these teams simply disappeared, their final destinations never confirmed. The interplay between vegetation and guerrilla tactics created a situation where opposing forces could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. A group could appear in one position and then literally disappear into the jungle in a matter of minutes. Attempts to pursue them were often futile. The persecuting group moved much more slowly through the vegetation than those who withdrew, especially if they knew specific trails and paths. Also, going deeper into the jungle often led to even more complicated situations. Commanders quickly learned that entering the dense vegetation in pursuit was often riskier than letting the group retreat. The very definition of tactical success became muddled in the jungle. In conventional conflicts, victory meant capturing and maintaining territory. But in Vietnam, especially in dense jungle areas, territory had little permanent strategic significance. An American unit could clear an area of the jungle of opposing forces, and then leave. Days or weeks later, the opposing forces simply returned. There was no way to permanently maintain control over the vast expanses of jungle. The jungle was simply jungle, and attempts to turn each operation into a significant advance were often thwarted by the reality that forces could always retreat into vegetation. The psychological impact of operating in an environment where you could never see clearly was profound. Soldiers developed an intense apprehension of the jungle. She became personified in their minds, not just as a hostile environment but as an active presence. Stories circulated of entire patrols that simply disappeared without a trace. From men who were found days later, lost and disoriented to just miles of safety. Of jungle that seemed to move, of trails that disappeared, of places where compasses did not work properly. How much of these stories was true and how much was the product of minds stressed to the extreme is impossible to say, but the effect was real. The jungle was in the minds of the soldiers as much as it was around them. The experience of serving in Vietnam, especially in the dense jungle areas, was fundamentally different from any previous American military experience. The veterans of this war returned home with a unique perspective on the limits of technology and military power. They had learned, in the most difficult way possible, that there are environments where all the material advantages of the world are neutralized by simple factors such as terrain and climate. That local knowledge and adaptation to the environment can compensate for inferiority in numbers and equipment. That nature, in its most primitive and implacable form, remains a force with which we must resort. Decades after the end of the war, the Vietnamese jungle remains. Areas that were defoliated regenerated, bomb craters were covered by new vegetation, military bases were reclaimed by the forest. The land itself seems to have erased the scars of war with efficiency that could be seen as indifference or as testament to the resilience of nature. The soldiers who served there grew old, many still carrying physical and psychological wounds from their experience. But the jungle continues, indifferent to the human suffering it has witnessed, a reminder that there are forces in this world that do not bow to the human will. This story of Vietnam's dense vegetation and its impact on American military operations teaches us important lessons. It reminds us that technology has its limits, that excessive reliance on material superiority can lead to unexpected results, that respect for the land, the climate and local adaptation are not signs of weakness but of wisdom. The Vietnamese forces that defended their own land were unsuccessful because they had superior equipment or greater numbers of soldiers. They succeeded in part because they understood and worked with their environment rather than against it. For the American soldiers who served in those jungles, the experience was a confrontation not only with opposing forces but with nature itself in its most challenging form. They faced heat, humidity, disease, dangerous animals, impossible terrain, and vegetation that seemed to actively conspire against them. Many showed extraordinary courage not only in operations but simply in continuing, day after day, through conditions that would test any human being to the limit. Their stories deserve to be remembered not only as chapters of military history, but as testimonies of human resilience in the face of almost unbearable adversity. The Vietnamese jungle remains one of the most challenging environments on Earth. It has defeated armies, engulfed civilizations, and remains a place where human presence is transient and precarious. For those who experienced it during the war, it remains in memories as a place of great challenge, an infinite green where every shadow could hide dangers, and where nature itself seemed to be in opposition to human presence. It is a humble reminder that, for all our technology and sophistication, we are still small in the face of the natural forces of our planet. As we reflect on these experiences and lessons, we are reminded of our own fragility as a species, that there are places in this world that were not made for us, where we are not dominant but vulnerable. And perhaps, somewhere deep in the Vietnamese jungle, there are still echoes of the footsteps of all those who marched through it, their voices silenced but not forgotten, their experiences a permanent testimony to the costs of war and the relentless power of nature. May their memories be honored, their stories told, and may future generations learn from the sufferings of those who have faced the jungle and have found that some challenges require more than military strength to overcome. May the Lord bless the memory of all those who suffered in those distant lands, and may we learn from history to build a wiser and more peaceful future.